that you're here to join us to participate in this important webinar. And we're very grateful to Laura Hanson, Dr. Laura Hanson, for being our speaker today. Dr. Hanson is a professor of geriatrics and director of palliative care at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Hanson has long-standing experience in geriatrics and palliative care research, particularly focused on populations with dementia. She also serves as one of the co-leads of our measurement core for the Palliative Care Research Cooperative and leads the patient and caregiver reported outcomes core for the Impact Collaboratory, which is a new initiative focused on dementia pragmatic trials. Dr. Hanson has a lot of experience in conducting clinical trials with this population, so we're particularly grateful that she's willing to share her wisdom with us. So thank you, Laura, for being with us today and for giving us your insights about this important topic.
Thank you, Naomi and Christine. I'm delighted to be joining the audience today and presenting on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. The full title of the presentation today is So You Want to Design a Clinical Trial to Help People with Dementia and Their Caregivers. Here's where to start. And then I put the answer in parentheses. It's outcomes. And that's really what our discussion today is going to be focused on. Here are my objectives for the time that we spend together. I'm going to start out by describing outcomes that we know are relevant for people living with dementia and their caregivers, really the group that we want to address in this field of research. And then we're going to spend time discussing how, as an investigator, you might approach selecting outcomes if you were designing a clinical trial for people with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. I'll talk about outcome domains as well as measures that match up with those domains for both patients living with the disease and for their caregivers. And then I'll also spend some time talking about data capture options for outcome assessments, because that may affect the way that you think about approaching outcomes for trial design. One of my other objectives is to hear your questions and comments, because I hope this will have a time for interaction at the end, and hope you're sort of taking notes and posing questions along the way for our discussion. I want to acknowledge funding from NINR in support of the Palliative Care Research Cooperative Group and my role in the PCRC, as well as from NIA for the Impact Collaboratory and my role in Impact. And I, rather than they, take responsibility for the content of this presentation. So let's start out and talk some about outcomes for AD, ADRD clinical trials and the relevance of these outcomes to people living with dementia and their caregivers. I'm going to provide some context regarding both some of the terminology I'm going to use, as well as the context for individuals living with this disease and their caregivers. We use the term dementia, and I'll use that term throughout, but I'll also use the term AD, ADRD, and I want to explain that term, which may be a little bit unfamiliar. AD, ADRD is Alzheimer's disease plus Alzheimer's disease related dementias. And this grouping of different underlying disease states is useful in thinking about our approach to research as we think about who the individuals are that we're interested in helping. In our coding system, dementia has become major neurocognitive disorder as well. So sometimes that terminology you will see used, although that's, as I said, primarily in ICD coding. What we really mean by all these terms is a clinical syndrome that involves decline in multiple domains of cognition. Memory is often the first thing thought of, but not necessary for the definition. Language, executive function, attention, perception, and motor function, as well as social cognition. And these declines in domains of cognition need to be significant enough that they affect function, as well as exclusion of other conditions that might mimic dementia. It's important to point out, as the term AD, ADRD does, that this is not one disease process, but rather has multiple underlying etiologies. And sometimes clinically or within health record information, we know the underlying etiology. Many times we do not. And these include the neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and Lewy body dementia, as well as vascular dementia, and a large group of individuals who have mixed pathophysiology, so would have Alzheimer's disease, for example, plus elements of vascular dementia. Alcohol is another major underlying etiology, and then there are many, many other underlying causes. These get grouped together as AD, ADRD, but do not include generally some of the more uncommon causes, alcohol-induced dementia, or dementia that's brought on by singular stroke without contributions from Alzheimer's. Dementia palliative care research is really an emerging field, so if it's a field you're interested in, welcome to my world. It's an exciting field, but there are many gaps in both outcome assessments and in biobehavioral clinical trial opportunities. So hopefully some of you are thinking about filling those gaps. For example, in outcome assessment, we really still struggle to know for sure how stakeholders, particularly people living with dementia and their caregivers, prioritize a variety of outcomes, and I'll talk some more about that. We also have a variety of outcome measures we can use, but we need more research on measurement that is responsive to interventions, particularly in areas of symptom distress, quality of life, or data capture for goal concordant care. In terms of opportunities for clinical trials, the efficacy of different dementia-specific palliative care interventions, the efficacy or effectiveness of specific symptom treatment interventions for this population, innovative models to support family caregiving, and emerging emphasis on pragmatic clinical trials, ways that we can reach and really have an impact on the very large population living with this illness. In palliative care, arguably, we might be concerned about the entire spectrum of stages of dementia, but much of palliative care research to date has focused on the later stages of the disease. The Global Deterioration Scale or the FAST staging system are examples of commonly used staging systems. And I just want to describe these a little bit again for a shared understanding. In stage 6, sometimes called severe dementia or moderately severe dementia, people are unable to verbalize recent events in their experience, and they require assistance for most activities of daily living. In stage 7, which is the most advanced stage of dementia that we typically describe, individuals have sparse or even no verbal communication. They're unable to walk and sit independently, and in a really tragic aspect of the latest stage of disease, are unable to recognize family and friends. We know that this disease also causes a lot of symptom distress, and this is data from Susan Mitchell's prospective cohort Cascade study showing the frequency of nursing home residents experiencing different symptoms. The bars represent the quarters of the last year of life leading up to death. And what you can see here is that shortness of breath, pain, pressure ulcers, and episodes of aspiration are increasingly common as individuals move toward death, where agitation, not my favorite term clinically, but emotional distress is quite prevalent and common throughout that entire last year. So this gives some sort of description of the distress that we might be attempting to address with intervention research. We know that caregivers are also highly impacted. There are millions of Americans living with dementia, but that means there are also millions of impacted caregivers. And I like to use this sort of description of caregiving that comes from the Alzheimer's Association, that caregivers average 22 hours per week for the last 3 years of the trajectory of the illness. If you think about that, that's adding a part-time job. And it's a real job that has real impacts on the lives of caregivers. Even though 2 out of 3 deaths occur in nursing homes, that means that 1 out of 3 is in the community, and caregivers are not excused from the table just because someone is living in a long-term care facility. Loving caregivers are very involved. Primary physicians have been described as missing in action in that there's a lot less engagement typically with physicians in this disease, which can leave caregivers struggling. Access to hospice is limited. Family expenditures are extraordinarily high, and not surprisingly, there are adverse health outcomes for caregivers. Some other characteristics to keep in mind: dementia has no specific terminal illness stage, and people live with the most advanced stage of disease for 1 to 2 years. And this has profound effects on caregivers' prognostic understanding as well as hospice referral. Pain and neuropsychiatric symptoms are common, but the approaches that we might use have to differ both for assessment and for intervention. And then medical complications become frequent with infections, falls and injuries, and nutritional decline, all of which drive the need for surrogate decision-making, often by that same family caregiver who's already stretched thin. So how do we think about outcomes and their relevance to stakeholders if we are seeking to design clinical trials? Well, I want to point you through the course of this presentation to a group of resources that I think will be helpful to you. And this is the first one. In 2018, the Alzheimer's Association renewed their review of dementia care practice recommendations. And they use a great deal of stakeholder alignment to ensure that these recommendations are grounded in the lived experience of the illness, the experience of family caregivers, as well as the wisdom of health professionals who interact with this population. So I want to recommend these care practice recommendations as a resource for thinking about when outcomes are relevant to key stakeholders. Now let's move on and actually talk about outcomes. And I want to just pause here and say why I'm focused on outcomes when we're really talking about the design of clinical trials. I find when I'm working with a variety of investigators in different fields, not simply this field, that often when we as investigators decide to design a trial, we start with the intervention. We think, wouldn't it be cool if we could? And we think about what the intervention is, what we would do, how we would do it, how we would help. It's a natural instinct driven, I think, by many of us as doers in our clinical roles or in our academic or research roles. But I always encourage, both in my own research work and when I'm working with other investigators, starting with outcomes. Until you know what you are hoping to change, and by definition, that's the outcome measure, it's hard to know how the intervention should be designed. So I'm going to focus the rest of this presentation on thinking about outcomes in the design of clinical trials, testing biobehavioral interventions to help people living with AD, ADRD, as well as their caregivers. And as I talk about different domains and measures, I want you to be thinking, if I wanted to improve that outcome, what would it take? What would the intervention need to look like? And how would it have impact on that particular outcome? So here's an example drawn from some work by a variety of colleagues of person-centered outcome domains for AD, ADRD clinical trials. Arguably, a trial could focus on the outcome of longevity, on survival. And that could be important to individuals living with this disease. A second important domain, and I would say as a clinician, a really important domain is function and cognitive function, because they're tightly linked in this group of diseases. People want to function independently or with as much independence as possible despite the changes that the disease is causing. So interventions that can enhance function would be welcome. Symptom distress, I've shown you some of the data about symptom distress in dementia. We need more interventions to address pain in people living with dementia, neuropsychiatric symptoms for individuals living with dementia, feeding symptom distress, which affects both family caregivers and the individuals. Neuropsychiatric distress, which is really an area of symptom outcomes, but has lots of implications for daily functioning as well as for caregiving needs. The domain of quality of life, central to palliative care, but an area that is somewhat mysterious in dementia, and I'll talk a little more about that. And then finally, the quality of communication and care experienced both by the individual and the caregiver. So I'm here to tell you that those domains have measures, and there's, as usual, quite an array of potential person-centered measures that could be used in clinical trials for the AD-ADRD population. I've listed them here, and I've specifically pulled out individual measures that may be familiar to many of you, as well as highlighting their abbreviations, because those are sometimes how we know them. These range from relatively long to quite short instruments, but Many of them have been used in descriptive research, and some of them have been used in ADRD clinical trials. This is only a sampling of your opportunities for outcome measures in these domains of outcomes, but I wanted you to see that there's a richness here, and I'll be pointing you to resources to learn more. Now, the reality of living with dementia is that it's a dyadic experience. And I want to include caregivers and caregiver research in this discussion. But for investigators who are interested in ADRD clinical trials, think carefully about how caregivers are part of the research protocol. There are a number of potential roles for caregivers. Caregivers could certainly simply be contacted to give proxy consent for the participation of somebody who, due to progressive dementia, cannot consent to research participation themselves. They might simply function as practical support for the person with cognitive impairment to participate, helping them get to research visits, for example. A caregiver might serve as a proxy respondent either throughout the research study or when the individual who has underlying dementia loses capacity in the course of follow-up. And then finally, caregivers could be included as research participants themselves, either as the primary focus of your study or because you want to include caregiver-centered outcomes as well as person-centered outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about that. There are a variety of caregiver-centered outcome domains that you might consider including, either because your primary focus is the caregiver or because you want to know about the caregiver's experience while concurrently studying the experience of the person living with dementia. A common area of measurement of caregiver outcomes would be caregiver burden or strain. But it's important to remember that caregiving has benefits as well, and that caregivers can be very satisfied as well as stressed or dissatisfied. So there are measures available for both aspects of caregiving. Time in caregiving may be something that is important as an outcome measure. Distress related to dementia caregiving specifically is actually available as an outcome measure opportunity. Communication in the healthcare system is something that's really important to caregivers. I mentioned previously that physicians have been described as missing in action in this disease. And so there's actually an individual measure available for physician communication specifically. Decision-making is critical, particularly in the later stages of disease when the caregiver also functions as a surrogate decision maker. And then preparedness is another domain for caregiver-centered outcomes as caregivers prepare for their caregiving role. Caregivers also may have outcomes that are absolutely essential to study in interventions that are specific to the caregiver's health and well-being, distinct in an important way from outcome measures that capture the caregiving experience. Remember, I said early on that dementia caregiving, because it goes on for an extended period of time and because it is quite demanding, actually has impacts on caregiver health and well-being, including their quality of life, their physical health, their mood state, and then, of course, their experience after the death of the individual with dementia. All right, let's switch gears. That's given you some food for thought about outcome domains and measures that can be used to capture those domains. Now let's talk about AD/ADRD outcomes in terms of data sources and data capture. So just to give a kind of overview of data sources for outcomes and methods for data capture, I wanted to draw your attention to thinking carefully about patient and caregiver reported outcomes, which really are the primary data capture method for person-reported outcomes or caregiver-reported outcomes that detail the lived experience of dementia or caregiving for dementia, and contrast those with data capture from existing data sources that would include federally administered data sets, electronic health records, and administrative data sources. I would argue that both types of outcome data capture are candidates for AD/ADRD clinical trial design, and they make important contributions, but as an investigator, you want to think carefully about where your outcomes will be captured. So let's talk first about person and caregiver reported outcomes. These are questionnaires that provide for the self-report of the lived experience of dementia and dementia caregiving. These are likely to really resonate with stakeholders. And these outcome methods have incredible strength because they directly value the voice of the person and their caregiver by allowing them to self-report their experience. These are also typically captured using instruments that have established psychometric properties. Another strength, you can dive into the world of measurement instruments and find individual instruments that probably capture the domain of interest that have established validity, reliability, and possibly even responsiveness to intervention. It's important when looking at these patient and caregiver reported outcome instruments to consider that instruments are valid for the context in which they were originally developed, designed, and tested. And that has some implications for research with the AD/ADRD population. So you might ask the question, is this instrument adapted for proxy reporting, knowing that you're going to be working with a population that might be able to self-report at the beginning of your 12-month data collection, but lose capacity to self-report later? You might want to ask if these have been adapted specifically to the dementia population that you're interested in studying. Maybe they were originally designed for a broad palliative care population. Have they been adapted to dementia, or do they need that? Maybe they were designed for dementia caregiving, but with an early stage population, and you have to ask the question, are they adaptable to late stage caregiving, which may be a very different experience. And then finally, as with many instruments, you have to consider whether they are culturally appropriate and are available in languages that are relevant to the patient and caregiver population of interest. Some other things to consider. With patient and caregiver reported outcomes, you need to consider the mode or modes of administration. Are you going to administer this outcome assessment in person, using telephone, in a written form, in an electronic format? Is it going to be self-administered, or, and this is very, very important in AD, ADRD research. Are you going to provide some support for completion? Individuals with AD, ADRD themselves almost always need some form of support for completion of instruments. And given the stresses, strains, and demands on caregivers, they may also need support for completion. That's an extra challenge or demand in your research protocol, but absolutely important to consider. You will need to address the burden on respondents based on the number of items and the time required to complete the outcome assessments, as well as the costs to your team to administer and track these assessments. I've given you another resource here, a reference to the Kosman standards for the selection of health measurement instruments. When looking at PCROs, this is an excellent reference resource for thinking about how to select instruments that have good properties for your research study. So what does success look like if you're designing your research protocol with PCROs? Well, success for the person living with ADRD and their caregiver is that the survey that you design and ask them to complete is highly relevant to their experience. That means the outcomes that you've selected are highly relevant to their lived experience. Research staff establish rapport with the respondents and provide the appropriate level of support for completion, and surveys are easy to complete. Success for your research team is clinical relevance is clear in the outcome assessments you've chosen, and there are psychometric strengths to the outcome measure. Your protocol for data capture is rigorous and thorough, and you have real-time data capture tracking and feedback so that when you see slip-ups, you know they're there in time and you can correct them. And then finally, I think I've already highlighted that you need adequate staff time to support this aspect of your research protocol. Now let's turn our attention to outcomes from existing data sources. This is a really important opportunity to think through. And I'll talk a little bit more about the strengths of using this methodology for outcome assessments. It's important for AD, ADRD research for a couple of big reasons that I would like for you to consider. One is that many of the federally administered data sets and administrative data sources are relevant to this population because of the healthcare settings this population frequents, and because the vast majority of the population living with AD, ADRD is over 65 and therefore connected to the Medicare administrative data source. A second reason is an emerging emphasis on pragmatic trials and trials of biobehavioral interventions that have the potential to really truly impact public health for this very large population. PCROs are wonderful because they focus on the lived experience, but they can be very difficult and costly to administer and can impede pragmatic research. So let's just talk about existing data sources that might present opportunities. Well, there are the federally administered data sets that could present opportunities for outcome assessments. The minimum data set in nursing homes, the hospice item set and hospice CAPS, which is relevant to individuals enrolled in hospice, OASIS, which is a data set that is administered in home health, and then electronic health records, which are going to be available, although varied, in hospitals and typically in nursing homes. One thing to recognize about these federally administered data sets is that fundamentally they are not available for individuals with AD, ADRD who are primarily being cared for at home by family caregivers, for individuals living in assisted living or utilizing other community-based care settings such as adult daycare. So if your primary focus is on one of those settings, this kind of data source would not be readily available. On the other hand, you could think about data from administrative sources, survival data from public health records, healthcare utilization, or healthcare costs to insurers available utilizing Medicare data or data from other payers. So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues and considerations with outcomes from existing data sources. This really means using data capture from clinical or administratively collected data available for use as outcome measures in embedded or pragmatic clinical trials with a larger scope. A strength is that the data is fundamentally uniformly collected. Another strength is data completeness. Many of the federal data sources, for example, the minimum data set, is mandated for data collection, and it means that your missingness will be much less than it might be for PCROs. A third strength is that if your outcome can be assessed in this way, it's very low burden on the individual living with dementia and their caregiver. It's very low cost to collect and therefore is very pragmatic. But what are some of the things you need to consider? Well, one is the timing of the outcome assessment relative to your clinical trial intervention. Let's just take, for example, the use of an outcome assessment having to do with the pain experience as captured in the minimum data set for individuals living with ADRD in a nursing facility. That data capture is going to happen on a quarterly basis, but perhaps you need information on the outcome of pain more proximate to a clinical trial intervention that takes place at the beginning of the quarter, and you think data capture at the end of the quarter will not be appropriate. You also have to consider the match between the intervention and the measure, because you don't get to pick these measures. You get to utilize what's already there, but you don't get to adapt it. And you may need to validate the outcome assessment in an existing data source against a gold standard PCRO to be confident that it really matches relevance to stakeholders in a way that works for your research question. So what does success look like if you're using outcomes with existing data sources? Well, for the person with ADRD and the caregiver, this is a win because burden is minimal. They may even not be aware of data collection. And it really reflects many aspects of their lived experience as grounded in key healthcare settings like the nursing home or the hospital. And success for your research team is there because data capture is easier, more complete, and at least in many instances is more uniform across sites. Costs and burden are low. I'm going to give you an example out of my own experience just to kind of connect the dots between the more abstract description of outcome assessment and the design of a clinical trial by using the example of the Goals of Care randomized controlled trial. This trial was funded by NIA and was a clinical trial of a video decision aid and structured discussion by nursing home staff of goals of care for individuals living with late-stage dementia. It was a cluster randomized controlled trial that took place in 22 nursing home sites and enrolled 302 dyads of nursing home residents with late-stage dementia and their family decision makers. In these individuals, the primary goal of care was comfort for 65% at the time of enrollment in the trial, and for 79% at our final data endpoint collection at 9 months or at the time of death. And here are the outcomes that we chose to focus on. We chose to focus on improving quality of communication using in this case, caregiver reported outcome, a structured quality of communication measure. We looked at concordance between the healthcare team and the caregiver on goals guiding care using, again, structured items from an instrument to report on concordance with goals. We looked at palliative care in treatment plans using structured chart abstraction, and then looked at some episodes such as the use of the pulsed paradigm or hospital transfers, which again were data capture out of health records. So this allowed us to use information from 2 different forms of outcome assessment, existing data as well as caregiver reported outcomes. Now I want to point you to some important resources that I think will be helpful to you as supported by the Palliative Care Research Cooperative Group. In the measurement core, we have built a library of instruments relevant for palliative and end-of-life research to help investigators find and apply the best instruments for their research. This is a screenshot showing Antonia Bennett and myself, the co-leaders of the measurement core, and you can find us on the website. And within that website, you'll find a PCRC instrument library. The instrument library is available, and there are instructions on the website about how it's constructed, as well as how to obtain a copy. And here's what's in the instrument library. We have been funded and empowered to enrich the library with instruments that are specific to the AD-RD population, thanks to additional funding from NIA. And we in the library now include instruments with multiple domains, quality of care at end of life, symptom distress in AD-RD, quality of care, quality of life, quality of communication, and function. When an instrument is available in the library, you will also be able to get detailed information about it, including the domain, the outcome domain that it addresses, specific content described within the instrument itself, such as subscales, its applicability to key populations or settings, look back or recall periods, the number of items, completion time, those again important for thinking about burden, who the respondent is, either the person living with dementia or a caregiver or a clinician, or perhaps the instrument was designed to be utilized with more than one type of respondent. You'll learn whether it requires an interviewer or could be done as a written survey. And then there are key citations with links to PubMed abstracts. All of this making your job easier when you're trying to think about a patient or caregiver reported outcome assessment that you're interested in using. Here's what the library actually looks like, just to give you a sense of the density of exciting and well-organized information that's available. And here's how you access the resource itself. You go to the PCRC measurement and caregiver core website sections. I've just walked you through our measurement core, but I also want to highlight for you, as I did earlier, the importance of caregivers in ADRD clinical trials. And there is a caregiver core for the PCRC as well. And there are caregiver resources that are available in that section of the website. And then the final resource that I want to point you toward is the Impact Collaboratory. We mentioned this throughout as an important national resource to promote ADRD pragmatic clinical trials. The Impact Collaboratory has a program of pilot funding for pragmatic trials, as well as technical assistance to investigators who are seeking that pilot funding. And the Impact Collaboratory is building a wide range of resources to promote future ADRD pragmatic trials in areas of measurement, diversity inclusion, pragmatic trial methods, and research ethics. So I hope that the resources that I've highlighted for you along the way, in addition to the things that I've said, will be helpful to you as you work to pick a key outcome domain and design your own clinical trial. So I think we're ready for questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanson. If there are any other questions, please do put them in the Q&R feature. We're getting close to the top of the hour, but we have seen a couple of questions come in. First, Dr. Hanson, can you talk more about best practices for transitioning to proxy responses to outcome measures as dementia progresses over time?
Oh, what a difficult question, but such an important one. I think a first best practice is to think about ADRD research, unless it is very short follow-up and early stage disease, as dyadic research. So to think very carefully that you are going to want to enroll dyads in the research, even if you are not focused on caregiving outcomes, in order to ensure that that caregiver, that second half of the key dyad, is available for this area of concern. The best practices are going to vary depending on how pragmatic the design of your intervention is. So if you are in a design that is much more real-world effectiveness or pragmatic in nature, then you are going to need to have to rely on the assessment of the basically the clinical providers or the clinical setting for that transition. When they make a transition to communicate with a surrogate, you are going to make that transition as well. If instead you are working much more closely with an efficacy design with much more direct involvement, let's say in data capture of patient and caregiver reported outcomes by research staff, then you should build in a brief assessment of cognitive capacity at each data collection cycle, and then use that brief assessment as a decision rule to help your research staff know when in the protocol to use surrogate response.
Thank you. And one of the challenges in collecting lived experiences of persons living with dementia can be recalling challenges. What are some steps we can take to ensure we capture quality data, for example, qualitatively? Is there a pre-assessment we should do before doing interviews with persons living with dementia?
So I think the question, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is about recall, is about the challenges, because we are asking people to recall their experience at the same time that they are living with an illness that affects their ability to do so. The sort of short answer to that, it's simplistic, is to look for outcome assessments that have a short look back period. So if you ask somebody living with dementia to tell you about their experience over the last day, their recall will be better than if you ask over the last month, for example. So that's one very concrete step. A second is, as I think the question implies, using mixed methods. So thinking carefully about whether you can combine some direct observation, let's say by a caregiver, with the self-report of the lived experience in order to be able to overcome some of those hurdles.
Thank you. And can you talk more about your experience with telephonic or visual data collection, since most research can't be performed in person due to COVID-19?
Now that's a novel question, isn't it? I don't think we know the answer to that, to be totally frank, at the moment. As the questioner, I'm sure many of you in the audience knows, many direct clinical research is being paused as a result of COVID-19 in the United States. There are, however, some wonderful platforms that can be used for data collection to support patient and caregiver reported outcomes. The use of video conference connections, the use of, for that matter, audio connections, so telephone survey data collection, it is well established as a methodology, and there's no reason to presume that that cannot be used as an adaptation in the era of COVID. There are many investigators in the field attempting or planning to do just that, and I think we're going to learn a lot about how effective those adaptations are for people with AD, ADRD.
That's an excellent point. Do you have any suggestions or resources regarding research with mild cognitive impairment before AD onset? In particular, I'm interested in intervention design considerations to reduce distress and enhance communication. However, I find most resources focused on moderate to severe dementia.
I love that question. It shows a research gap that I'm going to put in my next slide set. I think that in my reading of the AD/ADRD literature, there's a tremendous amount of focus on biomarkers, radiologic study, and other forms, and even treatment for the disease in people with very early stage disease or mild cognitive impairment. But there has been a real paucity of research on the lived experience for people with mild cognitive impairment. And I would applaud the investigator who asked that question and encourage that direction for research. It would be novel, and it would be best approached focusing on an assumption that those individuals can participate in research in the same way that individuals with, just to sort of describe it, normal cognition can participate. However, I would still encourage the concept of dyadic research. you may need to have a caregiver involved at a minimum as a potential proxy or as simply support for that individual with mild cognitive impairment to continue participation. But a very exciting idea.
Excellent. We have one more question. What domain does ACP fall under? Perhaps communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. But I would put advanced care planning under communication or decision making, although advanced care planning is really in some ways best thought of as decision making, and arguably decision making that's particularly challenging for people with cognitive conditions because it requires future projection, hypothetical thinking, that that kind of abstraction of future experience can be very difficult. But either communication or decision making, depending on the nature of the intervention.
Excellent. And are these resources applicable to patients with young onset dementia?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. Again, an excellent sort of question framing a research gap, but yes, many of the more pharmacologically oriented clinical trials for people with AD, ADRD enroll younger as well as older individuals, and there's no reason to presume that biobehavioral trials would differ.
Great. I think we answered all of our questions for today. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I'm sure Dr. Hanson would be willing to answer any questions via email if we don't get to them today. I want to thank everyone who's joined and thank again Dr. Hanson for speaking today. If all of our attendees do go to our website, we have 2 more webinars that are posted for the near future. Next up, we have Drs. Karen Kale and Lynn Adams to talk about the NIH grants process from submission to council. This is part 2 of their webinar series, so please catch the first part if you missed it on our website. And then in June, we have outcome measurement in pediatric palliative care intervention studies. And we have Drs. Antonia Bennett and Julie Childers speaking then. We hope that you do join us for those, and we will also be sending out an evaluation where we gather other topics that you might be interested in learning more about. So please take a minute to fill that out. I want to thank you again, Dr. Hanson, and to all of our attendees for attending. Take care, everybody.